I now have the pleasure of introducing you to our keynote speaker today, Jonathan Lowy. John Lowy is the president and founder of Global Action on Gun Violence, the only US-based nonprofit organization working with and for the international community to stop cross-border gun trafficking and prevent gun violence, founded in 2022. John has been a leader in litigation and advocacy for gun violence prevention for over 25 years, working previously as vice president of legal and chief counsel at Brady United. John serves as co-counsel for Mexico in their groundbreaking cases against the US gun industry in US federal court. John also pioneered the lawsuit for survival, Joaquin Oliver versus USA, filing in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the US government for violating human rights law by failing to protect people's right to live free from gunfire and causing Joaquin's death in the Parkland massacre. And those aren't even all the things in his printed bio, which you can read in the program. Simply put, John is a trailblazer in this field and has helped countless victims of gun violence. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you so much, Kaylee, for that gracious introduction, and thanks to the GW International Law Review for hosting this important symposium. As Kaylee mentioned, we really have an all-star lineup of experts from around the world today who I look forward to learning from, so I will try to keep my remarks brief. But I want to discuss this morning a way to reframe how we think about the gun violence crisis. Over the past 50 years or more, gun violence in the United States has been seen largely as a domestic political issue to be resolved by the US Congress and the President. But the US Congress has largely refused to enact and enforce gun regulations that are the norm in the rest of the world. And as a result, people in the United States are over 20 times more likely to be killed by gunfire than people in comparable countries. People in the United States are repeatedly slaughtered in schools, places of worship, stores, theaters, music festivals, and homes everywhere. Children are routinely killed, and the US Congress generally does nothing to stop it, or worse, takes actions to make that slaughter more likely. But it's often said that's a matter of political choice. If you don't like it, change the laws or change the lawmakers. And while I agree that domestic political action for gun control remains very important, I suggest that framing is wrong. And by reframing the issue, we can be led to new, bold solutions to gun violence. I will make 3 points this morning about how to reframe this issue, and a 4th point about a promising solution. First, as the title of this symposium suggests, gun violence is a global crisis. In fact, one of the most destructive and deadly facing the world today. Every year, over 250,000 people die from gunfire. That is more than annual combat deaths in every armed conflict on the planet. If the US is a proxy, then non-fatal gun injuries are almost double the fatalities, which would mean that every 2 years, well over 1 million people are shot in civilian gunfire. That is the scope of a world war occurring in our streets, homes, everywhere. And the harm goes beyond the deaths and injuries, as guns enable and facilitate organized crime, drug trafficking, migration, domestic violence, and political instability like we are seeing now in Haiti. Second, the global gun violence crisis is largely the product of the U.S. gun industry and U.S. policymakers who enable the industry's reckless, destructive practices. U.S. policymakers and gun companies choose to prioritize gun industry profits and so-called gun rights over public safety and human rights, including the right of people to live. And those decisions cause death and other harms throughout the Americas and the globe. It is no coincidence that 60% of the world's gun deaths take place in the United States, Mexico, and 4 other countries in the Americas. Many of those guns are trafficked in or from the United States as a result of U.S. gun industry practices and U.S. government policies. Mexico, for example, has 1 gun store on a military base and strong laws that make it difficult for criminals to obtain guns. One could say that Mexico has put up a legal wall to keep out America's deadly guns. But because Mexico borders the world's largest and most unregulated gun market, the U.S. is able to send a flood of guns, you could say some of our worst guns, across the border. The result is that Mexico has the 3rd highest gun death totals in the world and has to battle ruthless cartels armed to the teeth with U.S. guns. 70 to 90% of Mexico's crime guns are trafficked from the U.S. as a direct result of gun industry practices and U.S. policies. The United States is the only nation with more guns than people, but the gun crisis doesn't result simply from the number of guns as much as from the deliberate practices of the gun industry. The industry deliberately chooses to make and sell guns in ways that they know arms criminals and causes gun violence. Over 20 years ago, U.S. law enforcement, the ATF, reported that about 5% of gun dealers sell about 90% of crime guns. And many of those crime guns are sold through high-risk business practices, such as straw purchases and sales of multiple guns to traffickers. The Department of Justice called on manufacturers to stop supplying these high crime gun selling dealers and asked them to only sell through dealers who are trained to not use these high-risk sales practices. Remarkably, gun manufacturers refused, and the gun industry continues to sell guns in exactly the ways they were told by the U.S. government supplies the criminal market. The obvious reason why they do this is to make profit off of the illegal gun market. As a result, gun traffickers can easily find a corrupt or reckless gun dealer who will sell them dozens of assault rifles, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Manufacturers will happily supply those dealers, and the guns supply criminals and gangs in the U.S., Mexico, Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, Canada, and throughout the region. U.S. policymakers also make deliberate choices that enable the global gun crisis. They have, for the most part, made a deliberate choice to not enact strong laws that are the norm in the rest of the world, and are even more needed in the United States because of our large gun industry and our glut of guns. The U.S. does not even regulate the gun industry as much as it does far less dangerous industries, and it does not fully enforce the few existing laws in order to crack down on the gun industry. For example, Congress has chosen to allow gun sales by unlicensed sellers without any background check whatsoever. Congress has chosen to allow civilians to buy military-style assault rifles. Even 18-year-olds can legally buy them. There's no limit placed on how many guns individuals can buy. People are allowed to buy or carry guns without a license or any vetting by law enforcement other than a perfunctory criminal background check. And Congress has uniquely exempted the gun industry from some civil liability, from product safety regulation, from FOIA disclosure laws. So in many ways, the most dangerous product sold in America is the least regulated. Policymakers know from the experience of every other comparable country that gun violence can be largely eliminated through strong gun laws. In Japan, for example, it is as likely that you will be killed by a lightning strike as by a gunshot. Massachusetts, with strong laws, at least by US standards, has a gun death rate more than 10 times lower than Mississippi. And yet Mississippi is much more like the federal norm. And all of this enables the repeated slaughter of people in the US and throughout the region. US law enforcement has tended to give the industry a free pass, allowing dealers and manufacturers to recklessly, if not illegally, sell guns and profit. And they focus instead on prosecuting small-time traffickers who can easily be replaced. In sum, the US gun crisis is actually a global crisis, and it is not inevitable. My third point is that these choices by the US gun industry and US policymakers are not a permissible exercise of the free market or domestic governance. Human rights law does not allow the United States or any other country to stand idly by as their people are slaughtered, and it certainly does not allow a government to facilitate that slaughter by shielding bad actors from liability and failing to adequately regulate them. International and civil law does not allow the US or the gun industry to cause harm to other countries through its actions and inactions. You cannot dump toxins that poison the downstream water supply of your neighbors, nor can you enable and facilitate a crime gun pipeline that floods your neighbors with illegal guns. The gun industry violates its corporate and human rights responsibilities as well as its obligations under civil and criminal law by facilitating gun trafficking and violence. The panels you hear today will explore many of these issues in much more detail. So, in sum, gun violence is not a permissible domestic political choice. It is a global issue that involves violations of international human rights, civil and criminal law. And this leads me to my fourth point, which is a path forward that can end the problem of the US enabling gun industry damage to people here and throughout the world. A promising solution is to reform the gun industry and US policy by working outside of the constraining US political system by using international and legal action. Some of the best examples are the lawsuits that the government of Mexico has brought against the gun industry that I'm privileged to be counsel in. As you will hear later in the day, Mexico is alleging that gun manufacturers and dealers violate criminal law by aiding and abetting the illegal gun sales that arm the cartels, and that the manufacturers can therefore be liable for the harm caused by their trafficked guns. The First Circuit Court of Appeals recently upheld those claims, reversing a trial court dismissal. Another example of a promising action is the lawsuit for survival that Manny, Patricia, and Joaquin Oliver brought to hold the U.S. accountable for its failure to protect human rights. You'll hear from Manny and Professor Arturo Carrillo, who, along with his GW Civil and Human Rights Clinic, Global Action on Gun Violence, and myself, represent the Olivers. There are other actions that can and I believe must be taken to address the global gun crisis at its U.S. source, including in international bodies such as the United Nations, an Organization of American States, and international tribunals, as well as civil courts. These international actions are demanded by the international harms caused by the U.S., and they can be more effective than working solely in the U.S. political process because they are not encumbered by the backwards priorities and political constraints we have in the United States. And these actions have the law behind them. They can bring new pressures on the United States and the gun industry that they have never felt before. They can bring change, and they can save lives. My organization, Global Action on Gun Violence, is focused on bringing these sorts of bold new actions to end gun violence in the U.S. and throughout the world. I hope today's symposium will leave you all with new insights, new belief, and new hope in how together we can end the global gun violence crisis. Thank you.